kinds of psychology have application, have translational, messages. In the end, I think we all aim not just to understand the human condition, but to help the human condition. And cognition and cognitive development doesn't much relate. I mean, broadly speaking, it does, but it doesn't centrally relate to clinical issues. Um, but it does centrally relate, in my opinion, to educational issues. So I see it as a way of giving back, as it were, of using my expertise um, to, perhaps help out. But it's also a two-way street because you can have ideas and they don't really translate very smoothly to the world of actually working with kids and trying to support kids. So you find out that you maybe need to modify them. You also hear about issues that you never thought of. And it's just a really interesting way to not live in an ivory tower.
Yeah, we were just talking about Boyer's 1990 influential paper on kind of defining teaching as scholarship, and I was telling them, at some highly research intensive institutions, it wasn't stated in black and white, but sort of implicitly, the thought was that if you wanted to get tenure, you better publish your rear off and don't do a bad job at teaching, right? And you could get promoted, but Boyer, I think, and others have tried to change that somewhat by saying teaching and improvement of teaching and paying attention to the science of learning should be taken a little bit more seriously. Did you see a shift? You've been in the field a little bit longer than I have. Did you see a shift in the last, 30, 40 years in terms of maybe university faculty taking teaching a little bit more seriously?
I wish I could say yes, but instead what I've seen is a bifurcation. And when I first went into being a professor, I actually taught quite a lot. And nowadays, the university tends to want people to get grants, and if they get grants, they need to teach less just because there's only 24 hours in a day. And instead, they've been hiring full-time instructional faculty. And that is a trend not just at my university, but nationwide. So that we now have quite a lot of those folks, and they really spend all of their time thinking about their teaching practices. And as a result, I think perhaps they're better teachers than me because they spend a lot of time thinking about it and doing it and practicing it. What I worry about, though, is that because that's what they do and they don't do research and aren't really rewarded for doing research, they don't stay up to date. They all have PhDs, but 10 years pass, 20 years pass, lots of things happen. It's very difficult for them to stay up to date. Um, so I don't like that split. And I guess what I'm saying is that in some ways, I think the problem is getting worse, not better. That's the honest answer.
Yeah, thank you. We sometimes have brutal honesty in this class, which is
Yeah.
what makes it a lot better. Thank you. We have a student who has a question for you. Mary, go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Newcombe. I do have a question. Again, I always have two questions, so I'm going to ask you the first one.
Okay.
You looked at delayed and immediate feedback, or at least you mentioned it, and it was on the mini classes, I think. So, is there any determination for the type of feedback that was given? And if there is no determination, aren't we comparing the incomparable? Like, how does that work? Whether someone is just giving you a yes or a no, or they're actually having a conversation with you. And isn't that important?
Are you talking about the study that I'm an author on of understanding the geological time scale?
No,
I'm
it was
not sure
something
what you're
that you,
talking about.
it was something that you mentioned in the paper that we read, that there was a look at the delayed feedback versus immediate feedback. And I think they used mini classes for it. And
Yeah.
it said that there really wasn't a big difference. So I'm asking, did they determine what type of feedback? Or is it just feedback, period? And it didn't matter the type.
Um, Honestly, I'm not quite sure what that
Okay.
is referring to. What
Oh, I thought it
work,
was okay.
what,
We
what,
read two papers, and I'll be honest,
yeah,
I thought
okay.
it was that one.
What I will say is that there is work which I'm not an author of and just actually do teach about to people and try to put into my practice, which is based on the idea that that retrieval practice is a powerful way of keeping material fresh and indeed, retarding forgetting and so forth. And so self-quizzing works even if you don't look up the answer. If you do look up the answer, it helps more, but it helps yet more if you answer a bunch of quiz items and then look up all the answers because there's delayed feedback. So basically, you're revving up your motor engine about a topic several times. So you do find out the right answer, but there's a delay before you get it. So that could be something. There's
Okay.
also a study that I was a part of that was on the geological time scale, and this is a little different point, so I think it's not quite what you're saying either, but I'll tell you about it because I did think it was interesting. So there were two teachers, and this was an accidental professors, accidental. They were both using certain materials to try to explain the geological time scale, which goes way, way, way back. People cannot fathom it. And when was the Permian? When was the Cambrian? All this kind of thing. And so they started using self-quizzing, and students were supposed to generate, I think, arrows for, when what was happening. Um, but one of the teachers had them actually do it, like click something and get their answer, like, okay, that's my answer. And then she would show the answer. The other one just accidentally didn't do that, basically because she hated clickers and didn't have clickers in her class. Um, and then the whole package of stuff that we had designed didn't really work. You had to actively generate an answer and then see, oh, it's right, or oh, it's wrong, and what direction and how much and how, whatever. But if you hadn't generated the answer, just sat there, okay, what's the answer? So both of those findings speak to something I think is important, which is how much mental work are you doing or forcing yourself to do.
Right.
So I'm not sure what you mean about delayed
Okay.
versus immediate feedback,
Yeah,
but
no, I think it was
yeah.
just in reference to sort of promoting mini classes as part of research. And I wonder how well it would work. Okay, so I do have a second question, and it's
Okay.
more just in general about the divide that I find that is between explicit instruction and discovery learning. And
Sure.
it's usually written or framed as didactic versus active, or something, where one is old and shouldn't be used, and it's got more of a positive spin. When I think a lot of us that are in the classroom see it as a spectrum. So
Absolutely.
why in research is there that constant divide instead of sort of an invitation to both and to
I don't
meet?
know. I mean, I do not subscribe to that. I think it's a dumb divide. Certainly, it's been a dialogue in teaching reading. It's been a dialogue in, oh, should you drill the math facts, or oh, should you get them to understand how 4 + 2 is 6, has to be 6, whatever. And the answer is absolutely both. They need to understand conceptually, they need to estimate answers so they know when something is utterly bizarre. At the same time, if you don't drill the math facts, It's going to take you forever to know that 4 plus 2 is 6. And you never sort of get anywhere if you can't do that quickly. So you need to do a little bit of both. And I think for classroom teachers, that just comes intuitively very often.
So is it researchers that keep this up, that keep up the
I
divide?
think so. I don't know in the world of education if there are people who keep it up. I think there are. I don't think it's only researchers. So in math education, for instance, there really are some educationally oriented people who will preach the one or the other. So I think it's both who, I think people just like to belong to schools of thought rather than to be eclectic. And yet often the middle of the road, more eclectic approach has much more going for it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Also, you can't just oppose discovery learning to didactic. I mean, there's like bad didactic and good didactic, right? I mean, it's silly.
Very good. Thank you. Taylor, you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yes, I have one. This one come came from something I kind of saw on social media. Because I try not to watch the news too much. But the new, I don't want to say fad, but the up and coming of AI and the concern about robot teaching, right? Um, I've gotten like obviously it's been a talk in the break rooms with other teachers. But I wanted to know your thoughts on like robot teachers and whether or not you think they would be able to match or even exceed teachers, especially like this course. Like I know a lot of us are in the mind brain education major part of our masters, but do you think that robots would be able to exceed human teachers in applying mind brain education principles, especially when it involves science of teaching and pedagogy into the classroom so that it can support deep transferable learning and not just you know fact fluency and um I guess a lack of mm, human qualities that teachers themselves bring to the classrooms. Do you feel like teachers and educators should be concerned in that aspect, being that, like you
Well,
said?
my hope would be that teachers can use these kinds of agents to manage some things that are otherwise difficult to manage, especially if you have quite a lot of children in the classroom. So I think we know that a more individualized approach is very often very good, but if you have 24 children in your classroom, you don't have time for individual one-on-one tutoring with each of those 24 kids. So, what, and it's not only AI, that's just the most recent instantiation. There's long been a search to build in so-called intelligent tutors and so forth. It's a little bit different like approach from the computer science point of view, but I think from the teacher point of view, it doesn't matter. These are sort of programs that somehow can work one-on-one with kids. And so it does give you the time because you can do one-on-one, and computers also are much better at humans at remembering volumes of raw statistics. So if a child routinely makes a certain kind of error, you might lose track of that, but a computer can keep track of the fact that, well, you know Bor subtraction with borrowing is like this kid's weak point because he always loses track of he's borrowed from the hundreds to get the tens up and then to go to the ones column, and then he forgets about the hundreds column. You might not notice it, partly because you have a human memory and partly because you have 24 kids in your classroom.
Mhm.
So I do think there are strengths, but what it can't make up for is kind of what you alluded to, the whole it's personal, it's relational, it's kids have personalities, kids need motivation, kids are shy or kids are bold or, and so classroom management is really important. Plus, there is evidence that you actually literally learn better with a person in the room just because of the relational aspect of it. Like this kind of teaching that we're doing now is not as good as if I had flown to Texas, even
Mhm.
though it's great though, on the other hand, because I probably wouldn't have been able to fly to Texas. But there's something about just being in the room with somebody.
Yes. Yes. Thank
Yeah.
you so much. Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Newcombe, I wanted to ask a question, then I'll get to Amber's question here. I saw that you had previously served as president of the International Mind, Brain, and Education Society. And I
Yes.
was just, as you may or may not know, this program that students are in for this master's is called a Master's in Mind, Brain, and Education, started by Mark Schwartz about 15 years ago.
Right.
I was wondering how you got into mind, brain, and education, and what's your thoughts on the current status of the field? I know that, 15 years ago, there were a lot of promises about mind, brain, and education. Do you think we've lived up to those? If you could just speak a little bit to that.
Well, I I think we're trying. The way I got into IMBIS in particular is that they invited me to speak. And that was back in, I don't know, the '07, '08 kind of range. And indeed, Mark was also a president of the organization at one point, Mark Schwartz. Um, he was successful in being able to found a program, so it's really wonderful that it's thriving, I guess, today. Um, I think that one of the structural problems that the field faces is that most schools of education have not adopted such a program. So a scientific society, and it, has a journal and whatever, can't really affect pre-service and in-service teachers all on its own. It's not really set up to do that. What we need are programs like the one I imagine you have at UT Arlington, but there aren't many of them.
Yeah.
So you tell me why you think there aren't more. I think it's a problem.
Yeah, well, that might be a conversation for you and me that would take longer than what
Yeah, and it's not really what the students are
no, no,
interested
no,
in,
it's it's
but
it's it's
it gives
fine.
them an idea that they're quite lucky, right?
I'll give you my response in a little bit longer email after class.
Okay,
But I
okay.
wanna I wanna get to Amber had her hand up for a question.
Oh, hi. So my question goes back to what Mary was referring to with the immediate and delayed. And so I kind of get what she's saying, but I'm going to rephrase it because it was only like a little snippet in there. And so I put a question mark next to that too. So going back to what you were saying about just math in general, when you're learning math facts and you're trying to get, when the kids are getting answers incorrect and you need to give them the feedback of how they got their answers wrong. So I think that's what she's meaning by is should we give feedback immediately or delayed? Because it says that, they found no difference in the effectiveness of giving that feedback immediately or giving it in a delay. So, for example, when we're doing simple math facts and they're getting it wrong, and should we immediately address it then or later within the week or next week?
Again, I think I need more context, and I think a lot depends on whether you're talking about individual instruction or group instruction. Um,
I just think in general, what is your
I
idea on
I
just
don't
giving
think
feedback?
you
Yeah.
want if someone if it's a whole classroom and you're having people rate what is 8 times 6. If somebody says 52, you don't want to let that stand because then the other kids are going to think that's the answer, right? So it's a little bit of a judgment call about some of these things. I think sometimes you want to wait to see if there's a pattern. Sometimes you might say, how did you get that answer? And try to probe why they think something. Um, I don't think there's a simple answer to this immediate versus delayed question. I'm sorry if I wrote something that was misleading. I'll have to look it up and see what I said.
I think, as you know, Dr. Newcombe, there's quite a literature in cognitive psychology that looks at, retrieval practice and also the timing in terms of feedback. And a lot of those studies use very simple facts for their stimulus questions. So they might have something, like what's the capital of Canada, which is Ottawa. And if a student doesn't know that, in some studies they found that rather than giving them immediate feedback, delaying that feedback a little bit can make retrieval practice a little bit more powerful. But your example, Amber, of teaching math to a classroom full of students, I would agree with Dr. Newcombe that you don't let a misconception go on for too long because that's too dangerous. Brianna, you have your hand up if you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to hear from you, Dr. Newcomb, of what you are referring to when you say an atypically developing learner. What specifically does that entail? And what might a study um, looking into atypically developing learners look like compared to current studies that we already see?
Well, I think atypical covers a lot of different kinds of atypicality. So I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to that.
Mm.
And in fact, we're still trying to understand to what extent there's, a pure dyslexic, a pure, dyscalculic, this kind of thing. Sometimes kids do overlap and, have both, etc. Um, so I guess the everyone is a little atypical too. I mean, it's not like everybody, an average encompasses variation also. Um, so, uh, you know, addressing learning differences, learning disabilities, whatever you want to call them, is a whole field unto itself. And I think the science of learning is more about people in the typically developing range. Because once you get out of the typically developing range, there are really questions about why they're there. Are there several different types within that? Certainly the issue of people with autistic spectrum disorder. There's probably different types, and certainly there are different degrees of severity. Um, ASD can overlap with attention deficit disorder, but of course you can have attention deficit disorder on its own. You can have that with and without hyperactivity. What you're getting into is developmental psychopathology, and I think that's pretty different from what mind brain education is centrally about, because it is more about kids in the sweet spot where, we all have a touch of attention deficit or whatever, but, not too much.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that answer because I was thinking about that and like all the complexities that go into studying atypically developing learners with all the various components. I was just wondering what that would look like. So I appreciate you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Newcombe. I want to be respectful of your time. I can't tell you, for me personally, this has been a real thrill because I get to meet you and get to talk with you a little bit. And I'm realizing now, we're asking you a lot of questions about a chapter you wrote, sort of an introduction to a lot of different things. And you never really got into a lot of things deeply. So, some of our questions we're asking you to explain one of the many hundred things you're mentioning in that chapter about, areas of research, things like that. In hindsight, I probably should have had a few directed questions to your specific areas of research and things like that, but maybe another time in the future. But again, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us. I'm going to send you an email later with some thoughts and maybe additional question on mind, brain, and education, because I'm interested in your perspective. And yeah, thank you, and
Yeah, great.
have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to chat.
Take care.
Okay, bye. Take care.